I was a man of the mosque, a teacher of the Quran, and a leader of my people, until I died on a freezing night and saw the truth that the world is not prepared to hear. What I saw regarding Muhammad and Jesus is a message so urgent it must reach you before January 22nd, 2026. My name is Imam Farhan al-Sayyid. For decades my life was defined by the minarets of Lahore, Pakistan. I was a man whose hands were calloused by the turning of sacred pages and whose heart was a fortress of tradition. I believed I knew the path to the Creator with an unshakable certainty. To me, the followers of Jesus were a people who had lost their way, following a corrupted message that I felt duty-bound to correct. I moved to the West to serve the diaspora, carrying the weight of my ancestors' faith into the cold winters of Michigan. I was respected, a pillar of the community, a man who spoke of the mercy of Allah 5 times a day. But on the night of December 28th, that mercy took a form I never could have imagined. The sky was a bruised, suffocating purple, and the Michigan air was so sharp it felt like it could cut through bone. I was driving home from a late-night study session at the Islamic Center, my mind filled with the verses of the evening prayer. The snow began to swirl, turning the world into a blinding sheet of white. I felt the tires of my car lose their grip on the asphalt, a slow, sickening slide toward the unknown. I saw the headlights of a heavy truck coming toward me, 2 predatory eyes in the darkness. There was no time for a long supplication. I only had enough breath to whisper a final prayer, thinking it would be my last. Then came the sound, a horrific, bone-shattering grinding of metal and the explosion of glass that seemed to echo inside my very soul. Everything went black, but it wasn't the blackness of sleep. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that lasted only a second before I was pulled upward, away from the wreckage, away from the cold, and away from the man I had been for 50 years. If you feel a stirring in your heart right now, do not ignore it. Most people will scroll past this video, distracted by the noise of a world that is passing away. But you were led here for a reason. This is not a coincidence. It is a divine appointment. Subscribe to Echoes of Return now so you don't lose this lifeline as the days count down toward January 22nd. Do not let your heart be hardened by the very distractions the King warned me about. Chapter 2. The Encounter. Beyond the Veil. I found myself standing in a place that words struggle to describe. It wasn't a room or a field, but a realm of pure, living light that felt more solid than the ground I had just left. There was no pain. The cold of the Michigan night was gone, replaced by a warmth that didn't just touch my skin, but filled my lungs and my heart. And then I saw him. My breath caught in my throat. Every story I had heard of the prophets, every verse I had memorized about the Spirit of God seemed to lead to this one moment. He was standing there, not as a distant figure, but as someone who had been waiting for me. His face was like the sun, brilliant and blinding, yet I could look at him without hurting my eyes. He looked like the men from the lands of my fathers, olive skin, dark hair, and hands that looked strong enough to hold the world, but gentle enough to dry a tear. As I looked at him, the weight of my upbringing pressed down on me. I thought of the Quran. I thought of my parents' warnings about those who associated others with the Almighty. I felt a wave of terror, wondering if I was in the presence of a truth I had spent my entire life denying. I wanted to run, to hide, to apologize for being in the wrong place, but he stepped toward me, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a peace that surpassed anything I had ever felt on a prayer rug. He didn't speak with his mouth at first. His presence spoke to my spirit. He knew my thoughts. He knew my fear. He knew the way I had defended my faith and looked down on his followers. "Farhan," he finally said, and the sound was like 1,000 mountain streams flowing together. It was a voice of absolute authority, yet it carried a tenderness that made me want to weep. "You have sought the truth with a sincere heart," he told me, "and because you asked to know the Creator, I have come to show you the face of the one who loves you." I fell to my knees, pressing my forehead against the floor of light. I realized that he was so much more than the prophet I had been taught about. He was the Word of God made flesh, the bridge between the broken world I had left and the eternal glory of this place. He reached down and touched my shoulder, and a surge of life went through me. I felt every sin, every mistake, and every bit of religious pride leave me in a single instant. I was clean. He helped me stand, and as I looked into his eyes, I saw the history of the world. He told me that I was being sent back, not because my time was over, but because a window of time was opening for the world. He told me that the month of January 2026 would be a turning point for all of humanity. He said that the world was asleep and that he was going to shake the foundations of the earth to wake up his children. He told me that I had to remember 5 specific things, 5 events that would occur before the month was out to serve as a map for those who were lost. Are you waiting for the world to end before you decide to stand for the truth? Many will see the signs and still choose the darkness because they are comfortable in their sleep. Comment: I am ready below if you refuse to let your family be left in the dark. Your engagement helps this message reach those who are currently blinded by the noise of the world. Do not be a silent witness to the coming shaking. Chapter 3: The 5 Signs of January. As I stood in that realm of starlight, the king did not let me linger in the comfort of his presence. He turned my gaze toward the earth, which appeared below us, not as a map of borders and nations, but as a living, breathing entity shrouded in a thin grey mist. He told me that the month of January 2026 would be the month of the Great Invitation, a final sequence of divine interventions designed to pierce through the noise of human rebellion. He spoke of 5 events, but it was the first 3 that he showed me in vivid, terrifying detail. The signs that would break the pride of the world before the final turning. The vision shifted with the speed of thought. Suddenly, we were hovering high above the ancient golden stones of Jerusalem. I saw the city I had always revered from a distance, the place where the prophets walked. The air felt heavy, saturated with an electric expectation. Jesus pointed his hand toward the Temple Mount, the site that has been the flashpoint of human conflict for centuries. On January 17th to 26, he said, his voice echoing like thunder over the Judean hills, "A sign will be given to the city of peace." I watched as the vision unfolded. It was midday in Jerusalem. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows across the crowded markets and the narrow alleys of the old city. But suddenly, the natural light seemed to dim, not because of a cloud, but because a greater light had arrived. A column of brilliant white gold light descended directly from the heavens onto the mount. It wasn't fire, and it wasn't a laser. It was a physical manifestation of the very glory I was standing in. I saw the people in the streets below. I saw my own people, Muslims at prayer in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, suddenly stop and rush into the courtyards. I saw Jews at the Western Wall and Christians in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, all pouring into the open air. For 7 hours, this pillar of light remained. It was visible to every satellite, every smartphone camera, and every human eye in the region. I saw newsrooms in London and New York scrambling, scientists talking about atmospheric anomalies and secret weapons, but they found nothing. It was the finger of God touching the earth. But the miracle wasn't just the light, it was what the light did to the hearts of men. For those 7 hours, the ancient hatred that has fueled the Middle East for generations simply vanished. I saw men who had been arguing over borders drop their maps and weep. I saw soldiers lay down their rifles and embrace the very people they had been trained to fear. The light was stripping away the walls of religion and revealing the raw hunger for the Father. Jesus told me that this would be the first trumpet blast, a signal that the age of man's cleverness was coming to an end. On January 17th, the world will have to decide, will they look at the light or will they turn back to the darkness? The vision pulled back from Jerusalem, skipping across the continents like a stone across water. Jesus turned his gaze toward the young, the children and the teenagers of the world. As an imam, I had often worried about the youth in my community, seeing them lost in their screens, disconnected from the faith of their fathers, searching for meaning in hollow places. On January 20th, Jesus told me, I will breathe life back into the dry bones of the next generation. I watched as a wave of invisible power swept across the globe. It wasn't a physical wind, but a spiritual one. I saw a university in Cairo where students had been mocking the very idea of the divine. Suddenly, as if a veil had been lifted, the laughter stopped. One by one, they began to weep, falling to their knees in the middle of the lecture halls. I saw a high school in the United States during a lunch break. Students who had been carrying knives and pills in their pockets suddenly pulled them out and dropped them on the floor, as if they had become red-hot coals. They didn't need a preacher. They didn't need a book. The Spirit of God was speaking directly to their minds. I saw them forming circles in the hallways, holding hands and praying with an intensity I had never seen in any mosque or church. Jesus explained that from January 20th onward, the world would see a movement that could not be explained by social media or human planning. He said, I am calling the children to lead the parents. I am taking those the world has discarded and making them my messengers. I saw young Muslim men and women in the heart of the Middle East having dreams of a man in white. They were waking up filled with a joy they couldn't describe, finding the peace that had been promised to the righteous, but finding it in the person of Jesus. They weren't leaving their love for the Creator. They were finally finding the one who had been standing at the door all along. Are you waiting for the world to end before you decide to stand for the truth? Many of you are watching your children drift away, and you feel helpless, yet you refuse to surrender your own heart to the King. Comment, I am ready if you refuse to let your family be left in the dark. Do not let your pride be the reason your household misses this awakening. Subscribe now, because the time for later is running out. The vibration of the singing youth was still echoing in my spirit when the scene shifted once more. Jesus raised his hand, and a profound solemnity filled the space. I saw the world as it is today, a place of constant, frantic noise. I saw the invisible waves of signals crisscrossing the planet, the flickering of billions of screens, the restless chatter of a race that is terrified of the quiet. Layla, Farhan, he corrected himself, addressing my spirit. The world has become a place of many words, but very little truth. On January 24th, 2026, I will pull back the curtain of noise. I watched the calendar in the vision turn to January 24th. At exactly midday in Jerusalem, the digital world went out. I saw the great glowing boards of Times Square turn black. I saw the smartphones in the hands of billions reflect only the stunned faces of those holding them. The constant stream of information, the arguments, the videos, it all vanished. But it wasn't just the technology. A great hush fell over the forests, the oceans and the mountains. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For 3 hours, the earth was wrapped in a blanket of absolute, holy silence. Jesus called it the Great Pause. He said, for 3 hours, I will give every soul the gift of silence so that they might finally hear. In that silence, The masks people wore began to crumble. Without the distraction of work or entertainment, they were left alone with their own memories and their own hearts. I saw a wealthy man in a glass office in Tokyo stare at his reflection and, for the first time, see the emptiness in his eyes. Then, the silence was filled, not by a sound from the outside, but by a voice within. Every person on earth heard it in their own tongue, the language they learned at their mother's knee. The voice did not shout. It asked a single, piercing question that echoed through the chambers of every heart. Where will you spend eternity? I saw a scientist who had spent his life trying to prove God was a myth. As that question hit him in the supernatural silence, his knees buckled. He couldn't argue with a voice that knew the secret rhythms of his own soul. I saw millions of people making a choice in those 3 hours that would define their entire future. Jesus told me that during this time, he was marking the hearts of those who were his. When the 3 hours ended, the world tried to go back to its noise, but the memory of the silence remained. The question was still ringing in their ears. I looked at the king and I realized that these signs were not meant to terrify but to rescue. He was shaking the world because he loved the world. But as the vision of the silence faded, I sensed that the next 2 signs would move from the heart to the very structures of human survival. The window was closing, and the message was becoming even more urgent. Chapter 4. The Miracle of the Bread. The silence of the 3 hours had left the world in a state of spiritual vertigo. As the digital screens flickered back to life, and the engines of industry began to roar once more, there was a desperate, frantic attempt by the leaders of the earth to explain away the stillness. I saw news anchors talking about solar flares and mass psychological phenomena. But the heart does not forget the sound of its maker. The question, where will you spend eternity, remained etched into the collective consciousness of humanity like a brand. Jesus stood beside me, his presence a steady anchor in the midst of the swirling visions of the world's growing panic. He looked at me, and I saw a different kind of intensity in his eyes, a fire that was not just about the spirit, but about the physical suffering of his creation. As an imam, I had spent my life collecting zakat, trying to feed the poor in the slums of Lahore and the struggling families in Michigan. I knew the hollow look in a hungry child's eyes. Farhan, he said, his voice resonating through the very fabric of the light around us. Man cannot live by bread alone, but I have seen the tears of those who have no bread at all. I have heard the cries of the orphans in the ruins and the whispers of the mothers whose cupboards are bare. Religion often talks of the soul while ignoring the stomach. But I am the Lord of the whole person. The vision shifted to the morning of January 27th, 2026. This was the 4th event, and it was a day designed to humiliate the systems of greed that have held the world captive for centuries. I saw the map of the world again, but this time specific areas began to glow with a soft, vibrant green light. The refugee camps in the Levant, the starving villages in sub-Saharan Africa, the inner cities of the West where families were choosing between heat and food. On January 27th, Jesus told me, I will show the world that I am the true provider. I will bypass the gates of the powerful and the storehouses of the hoarders. I watched as a miracle began to unfold in a crowded camp in a war-torn region. I saw a woman, her face etched with the weariness of years of loss, opening a small, tattered bag of flour that should have been empty. As she reached inside, her hand found it full. She poured it out, and it kept coming. She called her neighbors, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and joy. They brought their bowls, their sacks, and their rusted tins, and the more she gave, the more the bag stayed full. I saw the smell of fresh, warm bread begin to drift through the camp, a smell that shouldn't have been there, as there was no wood for fires and no ovens to bake in. Yet the bread was there, tangible and hot, appearing in the hands of the hungry. I thought of the stories in the Quran about the Ma'idah, the table spread from heaven sent down to the disciples of Isa. I realized that the same hand that provided then was moving now. This wasn't about politics or international aid packages. This was the creator of the heavens and the earth reaching down to feed his children directly. I saw children who had been skeletal and weak suddenly running through the streets of their villages, their mouths full of fruit that had appeared on withered trees overnight. I saw wells that had been dry for a decade suddenly gushing with sweet, clear water in the middle of the most parched deserts. It was a global feast, a supernatural rebuke to a world that has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. But as the food multiplied in the hands of the poor, a great shaking began in the halls of power. In the vision, I saw the great financial centers of the world, the gleaming towers of glass and steel where men sit behind monitors, controlling the flow of resources like modern-day pharaohs. On January 27th, a digital earthquake hit. I saw hidden ledgers and secret offshore accounts suddenly becoming visible to the public. I saw the hoarded grain and the hidden supplies of medicine that had been kept away, to drive up prices suddenly revealed on every screen. Jesus said, "What has been whispered in secret rooms will be shouted from the rooftops. I am exposing the shepherds who have fed themselves while the flock starved." I saw a powerful man in a dark suit sitting at a mahogany desk in a high-rise office. He was frantically trying to delete records of his corruption, but his hands wouldn't obey him. Instead, his fingers moved by a force he couldn't resist, typing out a full confession of his crimes and hitting send to every major news outlet. Across the world, the systems that rely on deception began to crumble. On the news, I saw reporters who had been paid to lie suddenly stop mid-sentence. They began to speak the truth about the corruption they had covered up, their voices trembling as the Spirit of God compelled them to be honest. It was a day of absolute chaos for the wicked, but a day of celebration for the righteous. Jesus turned to me and said, "The world believes that power belongs to those with the most gold. But on January 27th, I will remind them that the earth is mine and everything in it. I am taking the things that the world considers the least and using them to bring down the things that consider themselves great." I watched a scene in a small town in Michigan, not far from where I lived. I saw a food pantry that was about to close its doors because its shelves were empty. A group of volunteers was standing in the cold, praying. As they opened the doors on the morning of the 27th, they found the aisles overflowing with the finest produce, the most nourishing grains, and crates of milk that bore no marks of a factory or a brand. They began to give it away to anyone who passed by. People were stopping their cars, coming out of their houses, and as they ate this food, I saw their faces change. It wasn't just their hunger that was being satisfied, it was their souls. There was a supernatural quality to this sustenance. Those who ate it felt a sudden clarity, a removal of the fog of depression and anger that had plagued them for years. "I am feeding their bodies," Jesus whispered, "so that they may have the strength to see the truth of their spirits." The hungry are being fed in these visions, yet so many of you are spiritually starving while sitting at a table of plenty. You have seen the corruption of this world, you have seen the greed of the powerful, and yet you still hesitate to align yourself with the only kingdom that cannot be shaken. Share this video with 3 people you love right now. Don't let their blood be on your hands because you were too afraid to speak the truth while there was still time. Subscribe and comment. I will not be silent, to join the remnant that is waking up. As the vision of the global feast continued, I saw the reaction of the world's governments. They were terrified. They didn't know how to handle a population that was no longer dependent on their systems. I saw soldiers being ordered to seize the miraculously appearing food, to regulate the distribution. But every time a soldier reached for a bag of the bread with a heart of theft or a spirit of control, the food would vanish from his hand. It could only be received as a gift. It could not be stolen, sold, or hoarded. I saw a general shouting into a radio, his face red with rage because he couldn't control a miracle. I felt a deep sense of pride for the way the Creator was showing his mercy. It was a rebuke to every person who had ever said that God does not care about the physical suffering of the world. As an Imam, I had often struggled to explain why the righteous suffered while the wicked prospered. On January 27th, that question was answered by the bread of heaven itself. Jesus looked at me, and I felt he was preparing me for the final, most intense part of what I was to see. The movement was growing. From the light in Jerusalem to the awakening of the youth to the global silence and now the feeding of the hungry, it was all building toward a climax that would change the map of eternity forever. "The systems of man are falling, Farhan," he said, "but the great turning is yet to come. The hearts of your people are about to be set ablaze." The air in that place of starlight seemed to grow even more dense with meaning as we approached the final days of the vision. The 4 events I had already witnessed: the pillar in Jerusalem, the youth awakening, the global silence, and the miracle of the bread felt like a grand symphony building toward a final earth-shaking chord. I could see the world on the morning of January 30th, 2026, through the eyes of the King who stood beside me. The earth was reeling, the old world was cracked open, and the light of eternity was pouring through the fissures. Jesus turned to me, and his face held a look of such profound longing that I felt my own breath hitch. "Farhan," he said, his voice resonating through the very fabric of the light, "we have reached the final hours of the month. This is the great turning. For centuries, my children in the lands of your fathers have looked for a sign, and many have felt that the heavens were made of brass. But on January 30th and 31st, the heavens will not just open, they will vanish. I am going to walk through the dreams and the waking hours of millions at the exact same moment." He gestured toward the horizon, and suddenly we were hovering over the vast red deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. I saw the sun setting over the dunes, casting long dramatic shadows. I saw a group of men gathered around a fire in a remote camp, far from the influence of the cities. They were discussing the strange events of the month, their voices low with a mixture of fear and reverence. One of them, an elder with a white beard and eyes that had seen many decades of hardship, was holding a worn copy of the Quran. He was speaking of the mercy of Allah and the signs of the end times. At that exact moment, as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, the air around their fire began to shimmer. It wasn't a trick of the heat. I saw the men freeze. They didn't look at each other. They all looked at the same spot in the darkness. There, standing in the glow of their fire, was Jesus. He didn't look like a stranger. He looked like the one their souls had been pining for without knowing his name. I watched as the elder dropped his book and fell forward, his face in the sand. He wasn't afraid of a ghost, he was recognizing his king. Jesus reached out a hand, and though I was miles above them in the vision, I could feel the warmth of that touch. He spoke to them not of a new religion, but of the fulfillment of every promise ever made to the sons of Ishmael. "This is happening everywhere," Jesus whispered to me. The vision pulled back and began to skip across the Middle East like a stone across water. I saw a secret room in a city in Iran where a small group of people had gathered in fear, hiding from those who would punish them for their curiosity about the truth. Suddenly, the walls of the room seemed to become transparent like glass. The light of the Lord filled the space, and I saw their faces transform. Their fear evaporated, replaced by a courage that looked like diamonds. They saw him standing among them, showing them the marks on his hands. They realized that the one they had been told was a distant figure was actually their closest brother. The vision moved to the rugged mountains of Afghanistan. I saw a valley that had known only the sound of gunfire and the grief of widows for generations. On the night of January 30th, a silence fell over the ridges that was even deeper than the global silence of the 24th. I saw soldiers on both sides of a conflict drop their rifles. They weren't surrendering to each other, they were surrendering to the vision that appeared in the sky above the peaks. They saw the King of Peace riding upon the clouds, his eyes like lamps of fire. The hatred that had been passed down from father to son for centuries simply dissolved. They walked toward each other in the moonlight, not as enemies, but as children who had finally seen the truth. Jesus said to me, "I am the Prince of Peace, and I am reclaiming the territory that the enemy has claimed for too long. On these 2 days, the barriers of language to culture and history will be burned away by the intensity of my presence." I saw hospitals in Cairo and Baghdad. I saw wards filled with the sick and the dying. On the morning of January 31st, a wave of healing swept through the hallways. I saw a man who had been paralyzed for 20 years suddenly feel a warmth in his spine. He sat up, then he stood, and as he looked at the end of his bed, he saw Jesus standing there, nodding to him. The man didn't shout for a doctor, he shouted the name of the Lord. I saw blind eyes opening to see the light of a new day, and the first thing they saw was the face of the Savior. The great turning is happening before your eyes in this testimony, yet you are still turning away from the light in your own life. How many more signs do you need before you realize that your soul is at stake? Most will watch this and go back to their distractions, but you have been given a front row seat to the end of the age. Subscribe now and comment "I choose the light" to join the global movement of those who refuse to be left behind. Do not let this be the last time the Spirit calls your name. The vision began to slow down. Jesus turned to me, and his gaze felt like it was stitching my soul back together. "Farhan," he said, "the month of January 2026 is the final call. After these 2 days, the world will never be the same. Some will try to hide from the light, retreating into the caves of their own pride. But the invitation is for everyone." He reached out and touched my left arm, right where the doctors would later place the IV drip. I felt a searing heat, a mark of fire that didn't burn, but felt like it was being etched into my very being. "This is your seal," he told me. "When you doubt, when the world calls you a dreamer or a fool, look at this mark and remember that you have touched the eternal." The transition began. The garden of light and the visions of the world began to shimmer and fade. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in that warmth forever, away from the icy roads of Michigan and the struggles of a broken world. I started to weep, but Jesus took my hand one last time. "You are going back because you are my witness," he said, his voice like thunder that didn't hurt. "You carry the fragrance of this place now." Suddenly, the weight of my body rushed back to claim me. I felt the dull ache in my chest, the coldness of the hospital sheets, and the sharp smell of antiseptic. I opened my eyes to see a bright, flickering light, but it wasn't the glory of the King. It was the fluorescent bulb of the ICU. A nurse was standing over me, her eyes widening in shock. She dropped the clipboard she was holding. She called for the doctor, her voice trembling. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and tight. The only thing I could think of was the date. I needed to know how much time was left. As the doctors rushed in, marveling at my sudden return From a state where my brain had shown no activity for 7 minutes, I looked down at my arm. There, beneath the medical tape, I saw it, the faint glowing outline of a flame. It was the mark. It was the proof. I have spent the last few days in a daze of wonder and urgency. I have spoken to my family, and I have seen the confusion in their eyes. My son, who is studying to be a doctor, speaks of synapses and oxygen deprivation, trying to build a wall of logic around an event that defies every human measure. But my father, a man of the mosque like I was, he looked at the mark on my arm and fell silent. He couldn't explain it. No one can. We are now approaching the final window. The king told me that January 22nd is a threshold. The events of this month are a final invitation, a massive outpouring of grace before the seasons change. Whether you are in a mosque, a church, a synagogue, or sitting in a room where you believe in nothing at all, the light is coming for you. Conclusion. The final call to the Gospels. I sit here now, looking out at the snow-covered streets of Michigan, but my heart is still standing in that garden of light. The doctors at the hospital in Dearborn continue to cycle through my room, their brows furrowed as they stare at the monitors that track my vitals. To them, I am a medical anomaly, a man who returned from the edge of the grave with a heart that now beats with a strange, rhythmic certainty. They speak of spontaneous recovery, but they cannot explain the heat that radiates from my left arm. The mark, the seal of the witness, is not fading. As we draw closer to the dates the king showed me, it seems to pulse with a faint, internal warmth. It is a physical signature of the king, a proof that my spirit was not wandering in a void of oxygen deprivation, but was standing in the presence of the living truth. My father, a man who has spent 80 years in the service of the mosque, sat by my bed yesterday. He began to recite verses from the Quran, seeking to bring me comfort. I reached out and took his hand, and I told him, "Baba, the mercy you are reading about has a face. I have seen the one the book calls the Spirit of God." I saw the flicker of worry in his eyes, the fear that the accident had damaged my mind, but then I showed him the mark. He looked at it for a long time, his fingers hovering just above my skin, unable to touch the glow. He fell silent. In that silence I saw the walls of a lifetime of tradition begin to crack. He realized, as I have, that Allah did not lead me away from my heritage. He led me through it to the one who fulfills it. I am sharing this because the king told me that his sheep would recognize his voice. I am not here to argue about theology or to prove a point of history. I am here to tell you that the door is open, but it will not stay open forever. The events I have described, the pillar in Jerusalem on the 17th, the youth awakening on the 20th, are leading to a threshold. Jesus told me that January 22nd, 2026 is a day of marking. It is the day the window of grace begins to narrow. In the days of Noah, the door to the ark was open for a long time, and many mocked the warning as they went about their daily lives. But there came a moment when the hand of God himself shut the door. This January is your open door. The signs are not meant to entertain you, they are meant to rescue you before the great shaking begins. If you are listening to my voice, you are being given a chance that millions have prayed for. You are living in the most significant window of human history. The king is not a memory in a book, he is a living presence. And he is knocking at the door of your heart with a hand that bears the marks of his love for you. Whether you are in the heart of Lahore, the streets of London, or the suburbs of America, the light is reaching for you. I think of my students, the young men and women I taught to recite the scriptures. I think of the heavy burden of rules and rituals that never seem to bring them peace. I want to tell them, and I want to tell you, the search is over. The peace you have been looking for in your screens, in your careers, and even in your religious devotion is found in a person. I am returning to the Gospels, not as a rejection of my love for the Creator, but as a total surrender to His Word. I have seen the King of Peace, and He is reclaiming the territory of the human heart. He told me to tell you that your time is the most precious thing you own. Do not waste it on the shadows. Do not wait for the pillar of light to appear before you decide to believe. Choose the light now, while it is being offered in a whisper. The cost of following Him may be high. I may lose my standing in the community. I may be called a dreamer or a fool by those I have led for years. But what is the cost of a reputation compared to the glory of the King? What is the weight of man's opinion compared to the warmth of the seal upon my arm? We are standing on the edge of a cliff, and I am shouting to anyone who will listen. The King is at the door. He loves the children of Ishmael. He loves the children of Isaac. He has died for the world, and now He is living for you. You have stayed until the very end of this testimony because the Spirit of God is refusing to let you go. This is your final invitation before the window of January 22nd. If you turn away now, after hearing the truth from a man who died and returned, what more will it take to wake you? Do not let this be the moment you look back on with regret. Subscribe to Echoes of Return and join our community. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We want to pray for you and your nation as the shaking begins. Share this video with at least 3 people you care about. A single share can change a life forever. May the King of Peace find you ready when the light descends.